There was a period in my life when I started noticing how often I felt behind, without anyone actually telling me I was behind. It wasn't that I was losing a race, or missing a deadline, or failing at some measurable standard. It was quieter than that, almost like an ambient pressure in the background, humming beneath everything I did. I would scroll through updates, accomplishments, life events, relocations, milestones, launches, families, and promotions. And somehow the result wasn't admiration or inspiration. It was the sense that I was late for my own life. Late to what? Exactly, I couldn't say. There wasn't a starting line. There wasn't a finish line, but there was a race. And the strange thing is, I don't remember ever signing up for it. Most people won't say this out loud, but they live with it in private. The quiet fear that everyone else somehow figured out the pace of life, the order of events, the rhythm of progress, the choreography of becoming. Meanwhile, you are improvising as you go, hoping the tempo matches what everyone else hears. It's one of the realities of growing up in a world where comparison is no longer something that happens occasionally. It's continuous, ambient, and algorithmically optimized. It took me a while to realize that what I was experiencing didn't come from the events themselves. It came from timelines, not facts, not achievements, not choices, but the order in which those things seem to be happening for other people. Someone gets engaged at 26. Someone buys a house at 28. Someone starts a company at 23. Someone moves to another country at 30. Someone has kids at 29. Individually, these stories are neutral. Arranged as a timeline, they become a standard. And once a standard exists, the mind does what it always does. It evaluates. Psychologists call this social comparison, and they've been studying it for decades. But what those early studies didn't fully anticipate was the invention of a digital environment where timelines are not just visible, but curated, sorted, and accelerated. In earlier generations, you compared yourself to a few dozen people you knew personally. Today, you compare yourself to thousands, if not millions. And the distribution of success, beauty, milestones, and talent is not averaged. It's concentrated. You don't see the bell curve. You see the far right tail. You don't see the village. You see the highlight reel of the global village. You don't see typical lives. You see statistical anomalies. So, of course, you feel behind. You are comparing your life to outliers and treating them as baselines. But something even more subtle is happening beneath that. And this is where it starts affecting identity. Comparison doesn't just influence how we feel about our progress. It influences how we define who we are. Because identity is not built in isolation. It's built in relation to others. Human beings are relational creatures. We know ourselves by noticing the differences, similarities, and distances between us and the people around us. This is why comparison is not always negative. In its healthy form, comparison is informational. Children compare themselves to understand what humans can do. Adolescents compare themselves to figure out where they might belong. Adults compare to decide what goals are worth pursuing. Comparison becomes harmful not because it exists, but because it becomes constant. And because the scale at which we compare has grown absurdly wide. T here is a concept in sociology called reference groups, the people we use as a basis for self-evaluation. Historically, those reference groups were small, family, neighbors, coworkers, local community. But now your reference group is effectively the planet, and your mind was never designed for that. It's like trying to run a neighborhood 5K, but your brain keeps imagining you are competing in the Olympics. But the real twist, the part that caught me off guard when I finally named it, is this. Comparison doesn't just distort how we evaluate ourselves. It hijacks how we choose ourselves. When you don't know who you are yet, and let's be honest, most people don't until much later than they admit, comparison fills the gap. It becomes a shortcut for identity. If enough people your age are getting married, you start wondering if marriage should matter to you. If enough people are pursuing high-intensity careers, you start wondering if ambition is proof of worth. If enough people are traveling, posting, building, buying, achieving, documenting, or optimizing, you start wondering if those are markers of the correct life. It sounds dramatic to say identity gets hijacked, but that's exactly what happens. Because if identity is a story you tell about yourself, timelines are the plot points that make that story feel legitimate. Without plot points, the story feels unfinished. And an unfinished story always feels like a personal failure in a culture that worships completion. But here is the thing. Timelines are invented. There is no biological, moral, or universal schedule for when someone should find love, build a career, figure themselves out, heal their wounds, grow into maturity, or understand what happiness means. Cultural timelines are artifacts, not truths. And the most dangerous part is that cultures don't just create timelines. They create urgency around them. Urgency is what transforms a neutral event into a moral standard. Urgency whispers, "You are supposed to have done this by now." But the question no one stops to ask is, according to whom? Most timelines are inherited without examination. You absorb them not through active choice, but through exposure. And the mechanism responsible is subtle but powerful social proof. When enough people do something at a similar time, your brain doesn't conclude they made that choice. It concludes, this is normal. And once something becomes normal, opting out feels like failure even if it isn't. This is how identity gets shaped indirectly, not by authentic desire, but by avoiding the shame of being out of sync. And that's where the real damage occurs. Not in the comparison itself, but in the choices we make to avoid falling behind. Many people don't choose careers, partners, cities, lifestyles, beliefs, or ambitions out of genuine alignment. They choose them out of temporal conformity. They don't want to be late to the milestones that signal legitimacy in the eyes of others. They don't want to disappoint the timeline. At a certain point, I realized the feeling of being behind wasn't coming from failure. It was coming from the sense that other people were moving through life at a pace I didn't understand. And that pace, more than the achievements themselves, became the metric I judged myself by. It wasn't they did this. It was they did this by now. That tiny shift from event to timing is what turns ordinary life into a competition. Psychologists make a distinction here between two types of comparison, upward and downward. Upward comparison is when we look to people doing better than us. Downward comparison is when we compare ourselves to those doing worse. Social media has essentially eliminated downward comparison as a psychological tool. Most of the content we consume is exclusively upward, which means we lose the calibrating effect that downward comparison once provided. Instead of realizing we're doing fine, we constantly assume we're behind. But self-evaluation is only the surface layer. The deeper layer, the one that took me longer to articulate, is how comparison quietly shapes our choices. And this is where identity becomes vulnerable, because comparison doesn't simply affect how we judge ourselves, it affects how we choose ourselves. T here is a field in sociology that studies something called reference groups. The concept is simple. People evaluate themselves in relation to the group they consider their peers. Historically, your reference group was small, your classmates, coworkers, neighbors, or community. But digital environments have turned reference groups into something unnaturally broad. Your brain is now comparing your life trajectory to people you've never met, who live in different economies, cultures, family structures, and incentive systems. In other words, you are comparing timelines across contexts that don't match. When enough people who look like you, sound like you, or are your age start making similar choices, your brain doesn't register that as coincidence. It registers it as norms. And norms are among the most powerful forces in identity formation. They shape what people choose without ever needing to impose rules. No one has to say, "It's time to settle down," or "You should have figured out your career by now." The timeline itself does the talking. This leads to something I call temporal conformity. The idea that people try to synchronize their life decisions with their reference group, not because of genuine desire, but to avoid the discomfort of being out of sync. People don't just fear missing out on experiences. They fear being out of rhythm with the people around them. And rhythm is a crucial metaphor here, because the rhythm of modern life is fast, curated, and artificially accelerated. Platforms compress years of development, healing, or growth into highlight reels. You don't see the process, only the announcement. That makes pace feel like destiny and slowness feel like incompetence. But here is where the hijacking becomes particularly interesting. Comparison doesn't only influence what we think we should be doing, it influences what we think we should be wanting. And that distinction matters because wanting is the foundation of identity. Most people assume identity is about traits. I am introverted. I am ambitious. I am creative. But identity is built more fundamentally on preferences, what you desire, what you value, what you pursue, what you reject. And preferences are not as autonomous as people think. Behavioral scientists talk about something called conformity of aspiration. The idea that humans don't merely imitate behaviors, they imitate desires. If enough people in your group aspire to something, you'll start aspiring to it too, even if it doesn't align with your nature. This is how timelines become identity traps. You begin choosing goals you didn't choose, living stories you didn't author, pursuing successes that don't feel like success when you get them. And the scariest part is that this process rarely feels forced. Most people never realize their preferences have been outsourced. Comparison doesn't present itself as pressure. It presents itself as clarity. This is what matters. This is what success looks like. This is the pace of adulthood. This is how to be legitimate. The truth is that adulthood has no pace. There is no universal tempo for becoming. But because we live inside cultures that compress time into merit badges, degree by 22, marriage by 28, house by 32, stability by 35, we internalize something that feels like a biological schedule. And once it feels biological, it feels non-negotiable. There was a moment in my mid-20s when I looked around and realized how many life decisions were being made as reactions instead of choices. People weren't pursuing careers. They were avoiding falling behind. They weren't starting families. They were trying to meet the socially validated timeline for doing so. They weren't moving cities for curiosity. They were relocating because it looked like progression. The timeline wasn't a guide. It was a scoreboard, and that's when the philosophical layer becomes useful. Because comparison forces you to live life horizontally, you look left and right, constantly measuring distance. But meaning is built vertically. It comes from depth, not speed. It comes from alignment, not synchronization. It comes from asking, what is worth wanting? Instead of what are people like me wanting by now? T here is a strategic implication here, too. When you choose based on timelines, you optimize for short-term belonging. You get to feel on track. But when you choose based on alignment, you optimize for long-term coherence. You get to feel like yourself. And those two strategies lead to very different lives. Belonging feels good early. Coherence feels good later. But here is the final twist in the timeline trap. Timelines don't actually protect you from regret. People assume conforming to the timeline prevents them from making mistakes, but regret doesn't come from being late. Regret comes from being misaligned. If you arrive on time to the wrong life, you don't win anything. And once you see that clearly, the urgency dissolves. You start noticing that nothing about life actually requires synchronization. There is no late to personal growth. There is no late to understanding yourself. There is no late to choosing again. There is no late to becoming. The timeline only exists until you stop believing in it. The moment you stop pretending that your pace should match anyone else's, life stops feeling like a race and starts feeling like a landscape. Something you travel through, not something you compete in. And that's where identity begins. Because the self doesn't emerge from comparison, it emerges from orientation. Not where should I be by now, but where am I going? Not what are they doing? But what matters to me? Not what is normal, but what is true. In the end, the only timeline that matters is the one that matches your nature. And nature doesn't rush.